you had a lot of players whose careers ended at 32. You were old by then, and that's when you went off to sell insurance. So, there's so that's the big change. But for most of basketball's history, it was pretty similar. I mean, you got to 32, 33 years old, and that was it.
He is the author of The History of the NBA in 12 Games, from 24 seconds to 30,000 three-pointers, which is released on November 1st, 2022. We welcome Sean Deveney onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Sean?
I'm doing well, Justin. How are you?
Doing fantastic. Thanks for joining the show. We're just on the eve of the NBA season kicking off as of this recording, so it's great to have you on. Great timing, and great to discuss this book, because I think it is just such a great point just to break down kind of the history of the NBA as a whole. So that's kind of a basic question. What was the inspiration of the book?
I've written some other books. I've written some baseball history. I've done some other sort of history. And one thing that's always struck me, I've covered the NBA for a pretty long time here. It's been 22 years. So just when I look at books and I look at sort of the way history is treated in the NBA compared to baseball, compared to football, I just didn't feel like there's a lot represented in terms of the history of the league. So I really wanted to find a way to go way back to really the beginnings of the league and just tell the story of the league progressing from its early days in the 50s to what we see now with the three-pointers being the way that they are.
There's so many games to pick from, so many styles. What was your process? I'm just interested in seeing, like, how did you narrow all that down? That must have been an arduous process, or am I assuming, was it easier than what you expected, or was it a very intense process kind of narrowing those games to your selection that made the book?
Yeah, people who pick up the book might expect to see certain games in there, that are well known, that you would see on Hardwood Classics and classic ESPN, things like that you'd see over the course of time. Whether it's Game 6. Michael Jordan pushing Brian Russell, or you could go way back to the 1974 NBA Finals, Boston and Phoenix, when there was a triple overtime game. Certainly those are great games, but that's not really what I wanted to do. I wanted to pick 12 games that I felt sort of established where the NBA was at a certain point, and then sort of change things from there. So those are the games that I went for more than sort of the great games. I talk about in the intro, I talk about I was actually as a kid, as a 12-year-old kid at the game in which Michael Jordan scored 63 at the Boston Garden. It was a great game, but it wasn't really the game that changed things as far as Michael Jordan and the Bulls go. So I picked a different game on that, and that was sort of my approach. Was I wanted to find the games that really signified where the league was and how it changed thereafter.
Yeah, really awesome concept. Think that people are going to really, really enjoy reading this book. Wanted to ask, going back to the history of these different sports, is there any particular reason that with the NBA, it may seem to be more difficult to find topics like books related to the history of the sport?
I think part of it is, in the early days of the NBA, I think, I kind of go to what J.J. Redick said earlier this year about, Bob Cousy playing or whoever was playing against, firemen and plumbers. And I think that was the perception of the league in its early going, was that what we see in terms of basketball now is nothing close to what it was in its early days. Whereas baseball is kind of, obviously it changes as it goes, but it's pretty much the same game from 1910 through 2022. So I think that's part of it. And I think, though, that if you go back and you really do some research on the subject and you watch some of those old games and you talk to people who were there, you get a real sense that that wasn't these were good players and these were good athletes. It was a different game for sure, but there was definitely a high quality of basketball going on at that time. But I think that the perception being that it was kind of a rinky-dink ragtag league in its early going, and it was a different game. I think that's why the history part of it doesn't get as much respect as it should. I think that's changing, I should say. That I think the Michael Jordan documentary, I think of Jackie McMullen's book about Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, Chris Herring's recent book about the Knicks in the 90s. I think there is more, retrospect. There are more retrospectives on what's happened in the NBA over the years than we've seen in the past. But I really wanted to go all the way back and trail the whole history of the league.
As you mentioned, you've written books covering various different sports. I'm wondering, given what you just said, is it any easier, more difficult doing research on the history of the sport of basketball? I mean, it seems like a very tightly knit community in terms of those players that have played in the past, but is it any more difficult finding the info that you used, like for many of those earlier games that you cover in this book?
Yeah, getting to why the history of the NBA sort of gets overlooked. I think it's because the stats weren't really kept the same way in the early going either. That a home run's always been a home run and a touchdown's always been a touchdown. But they didn't have assists in 1956, right? So there's just different ways of measuring those things, and that's part of the problem, is that it is hard to compare the eras that way. But at the same time, I did find plenty of materials. I mean, if you go back and look, certainly by the 50s. And well into the 60s, basketball had established itself as a very popular sport, and fortunately, there's so many databases now to use as far as finding newspaper reports and finding old magazines and stuff that you can go through and really find a lot of information on what was going on at the time, and then you can supplement that either through your own interviews or interviews that have been conducted in other places. And that's always useful too. So it is a bit of a challenge, but I kind of like that challenge. You kind of get to become a bit of a detective, and that's enjoyable.
Sure. Did your perception of any of the eras of basketball, closer to present day or way in the past, did your perception of any of those eras change significantly, or even since you started covering the league 22 years ago, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I really think that, I spent a lot of time as a teenager and in my early 20s watching basketball in the 90s. I think, I remember it mostly for Michael Jordan. That was sort of the focus. I grew up in Boston, so it was a really bad time of history for the Celtics at that time. So I remember that as well. But I really wasn't paying attention to just the level of the physicality and indeed the brutality sometimes that would happen in the 90s. So really going back and looking at it, really watching those games, especially when you watch basketball now, it's almost jarring to watch a game from a Knicks Heat game from 1997, 1998. That was just barely recognizable as the same thing as today's game. So I think the 90s was an interesting time to look back at. The other thing that I found that was interesting is when you go back and you read the newspapers and you read the magazines of the time, how much of it was gossip and how much of it was this guy wants to get traded or this team wants to trade for that guy. They didn't have Twitter, but it was almost like they kind of did have Twitter. It's like all these rumors that was going on, going back to the 50s and 60s. That's not really as much of a new phenomenon as even I thought it was.
I'm sorry, Justin, one more question.
Sure,
I have to follow up on that. Because another question I have here that I wanted to ask that this ties into perfectly. Are the eras more similar than we give them credit for?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that physically, players now are just so, finely tuned, and they know so much about how to get the most out of their bodies. But for most of the time, there wasn't that much of a difference between the 60s and the 80s, for instance. That players just kind of, they kept in basketball shape, but it wasn't like the high tech sort of, what we see now. And so you had a lot of players whose careers ended at 32. You were old by then, and that's when you went off to sell insurance. So, there's so that's the big change. But for most of basketball's history, it was pretty similar. I mean, you got to 32, 33 years old, and that was it. That's one of the big changes. But that's one of the similarities that goes through eras is that physically these players were very, very similar throughout, and it's only recently that that's really changed.
Sean, I want to ask you, you mentioned the physicality of the 90s compared to the era of basketball that we're witnessing now. If you have a preference, what do you enjoy more? Do you enjoy more that physical play, or do you enjoy more maybe fights being broken up or that physical play, not approaching the heights as it was in previous eras?
Yeah, I think there's a happy medium there, and I think maybe we've swung too much the other way now, away from any kind of physicality. And I understand why, and I understand. I saw it happen. I remember covering the NBA Finals it was 2003, and it was the Spurs and the Nets, and it was something like Game 4 was 74-69. And I remember Greg Popovich after the game saying, we just set basketball back 15 years. And this was the finals. This was the two best teams. And he was right. And, look, that was ugly. That was unwise. I'd much rather watch this than that. At the same time, I do think we've probably gone a little too far in terms of spreading the floor and getting rid of the mid-range game altogether and just have everything be layups or 3-pointers. That's not quite it either for me. But certainly, I prefer that to what we were seeing in the early 2000s.
Are you concerned that just with the popularity of 3-pointers and Steph Curry, Trae Young spreading the floor, it can get out of control in terms of the NBA maybe introducing a 4-point shot or any other innovations, maybe 10, 20 years down the line, all sports evolve some ways. Do you see that being a reasonable fear just in terms of how we're seeing more long distance shooting, especially in recent years, or do you think the game will be contained?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's a real chance that sort of thing could develop. But I think that what we're seeing, if you look at over the last 10, 15 years, there's such a spike in 3-pointers, and now it's kind of reached a plateau. And I think the reason, we're not seeing it just go endlessly up the way it was before. It's kind of flattening out. And I think one reason is that defenses have found some ways to adjust. And I think the way to adjust is, with the switching defenses with guys who can guard multiple positions. You look at the Celtics last year, a good example of a team that had so much athleticism at so many different positions that you can get out and guard the 3-point line and still recover and guard the lane as well. So I think as more of those players gain value, and we're already seeing it, I believe, then that 3-point rise is going to level off, and I think you'll probably see more teams, look at, can we get a big guy? Can we bring back the post game a little bit, to take advantage of that? Because if you're going to be using guys like Draymond Green at a center, then as an opponent, you want to be able to put a 7-footer out there who can take advantage of them. So yeah, I do think it's going to swing back naturally the other way a little bit. But look, there's always going to be adjustments, like you say.
Interesting. So just to ask directly, the future of the league is maybe this more like versatility and a mix of the size and speed, like that length you need on the perimeter. What else would you think in terms of the next 5 to 10 years of the league in terms of that snapback?
Yeah, I do wonder, if some of these young unicorns, as they call them, if they're going to be able to stay healthy enough, for one thing. I mean, that's something that, obviously we've seen it with Chet Holmgren, and we'll see what happens with Wembanyama. But, that's something that, as far back as I can remember, that's, Bill Walton is a good example of a guy who's, big and had that versatility, that athleticism, but put so much pressure on his feet, and his feet just were never right. Right up through, Yao Ming did the same thing. Zydrunas Ilgauskas was a great player who wound up being a role player. But before his foot injuries, he was fantastic. It was going to get better. That's something that I wonder if, especially with the modern science and the modern medicine, if they can find ways not to only have Ralph Sampson, another good example, but if they can find ways to not only have these guys who have this ridiculous size, but also these physical gifts, if they can find ways to keep them healthy. Because if they can, if Chet Holmgren and Wembanyama, if they can have 15-year careers, I'm really interested to see how that goes.
You mentioned Victor, and we were talking about him with a previous guest just a few weeks ago. Is there anything in his game that you see that can, fight against previous trends of big men and kind of the injury woes that, like you said, they experience, in their first couple of years? There's been so many great, hyped big men over the years. And they, like you said, oftentimes they crash and burn just due to the injury bug. But, Victor's gaining a lot of hype, unlike anything I've seen since LeBron, possibly. Are you seeing anything in his game that he could, besides modern medicine, just the way he plays, do you see anything that might aid him in terms of preventing those pitfalls that other of his peers encountered?
Probably, I'd probably say the other way, that the way his athleticism, his ability to put the ball on the floor and attack, that's with most big guys, you're worrying about the feet. That's been what's historically been the problem for big guys. I think with him, you'd worry about knees too, because he is so active, and just how much he moves and how athletic he is. So, I'd probably be a little more worried about him just because of the amount of movement that he's able to work into his game.
Fascinating.
I'm no doctor, just to be clear. I'm not claiming.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, at a certain point, it's kind of physics. Like Giannis, I think of him hyperextending his knee in the playoffs. I mean, so much speed and power and longer limb lengths. I think you're right in that physics comes into play. Right. You wonder what they can do. I mean, of course, rehab and prehab, as they call it, are continuously advancing. But yeah, will be fascinating to see. I wanted to ask you, and I'm not going to give away the team or anything because I want people to dig into the book. I don't want to spoil things, but I do want your opinion on kind of this large topic that continually gets recycled in at least the NBA media. But there's a team that you cover where 3 superstars are brought in and team has chemistry issues the whole season. There's a pivotal game that you discussed. That's a very important one. And in reviewing this, my mind immediately goes to, oh, this is a super team. And this is a team from the 60s. Is this super team, has this been going on all along, and we just continually recycle this narrative? What are your thoughts on, past versus present super teams? And
I'll give it away. It was Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, and they were already a very, very good team in Los Angeles, and they go and they get Wilt Chamberlain and add him to the mix, and the assumption was that's it. There's nobody beating the Lakers, and they were an absolutely miserable bunch. They could not stand each other. They could not. Or most of the guys couldn't. Certainly, Wilt could not stand the coach, Butch Van Wiedekraft, and so it had the makings of a disaster. But they were so talented that they wind up winning. They wind up winning in the playoffs. They wind up winning the Western Conference, and they meet a Celtics team that's very, very beat up. And old at that point. I mean, Bill Russell's 34, I believe, and Sam Jones is 35. And they had a bunch of role players around them, guys like Don Nelson and Larry Siegfried, who weren't great players, but were pretty good role players. And the Celtics beat them. And it's reminiscent of of Dallas beating Miami in 2011. So, but yeah, I mean, it's that's been going on, right? It's not that new. That sort of thing happens. And, we also in the book talk about, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar forcing his way out of Milwaukee and going to Los Angeles as well. And, that's 1975. So, I mean, this is not when we get very upset because Anthony Davis wants a trade. It's already happened before, man. It's maybe he didn't handle it the right way and he handled it a different way, but it's something that, we've seen this movie before.
Do you think, based on the research that you did, thinking of the era back then, there's probably less info available on this, but was there the same or similar type of emotional reaction from the fans from what you could tell? Obviously smaller scope in the league, less cities, less franchises, no social media, but from what you could gather, what's the emotional response of the fans like?
I think it depends on the market. It was definitely an era where, and really all the eras up until, it's really only been the last 15 or 20 years where you didn't really have to think about market size, where you can kind of throw that out. Everything is, people are more fans of specific players as much as specific teams. But back then, it really depended on the market. The New York market was very, very basketball hungry. Los Angeles, when they got Wilt Chamberlain, and also when they got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and when they drafted Magic Johnson, they had these big elaborate press conferences with like dancing girls and like a full bar. And I was reading it, and it was like the press conference was like 10 in the morning, and the writers are up at them like, whoa. It's like Mad Men or something. But yeah, I mean, it was it definitely depended on the market. Obviously, Boston was a big market for basketball as well. But so it wasn't, I don't think there was, in Milwaukee, there wasn't a great hue and cry about losing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as much as there was a big, huge celebration going on in Los Angeles.
Sean, through your research, are there aspects of the game from previous eras that you wish would have carried on to what the game we're seeing today? Is there anything that, that's through the games that you selected, just aspects from on the floor, even off the floor, from maybe the media covers, just the NBA itself, that's been lost through time, that that should be brought back into the modern game that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, reporters had great access to, like they would sometimes fly on the planes with the players and stuff like that. I wouldn't mind seeing that come back. Certainly, the NBA at the time was, they needed the coverage. They were still behind the NFL and baseball firmly in terms of coverage, and they needed to get as much coverage as possible. But, I think the one thing that I'd like to have seen changed is that I would like to have seen international players come into the league earlier. I cover a little bit in the Dirk Nowitzki chapter. I talk a little bit about Arvydas Sabonis, and he didn't wind up getting into the NBA until he was pretty much a spent force. He wasn't. Right. He wasn't. He wasn't himself. But when you talk to people or you read accounts of how good he was in the early 80s, man, I would have loved to have seen him have a full NBA career. And there was this great Yugoslavian teams with Drazen Petrovic and Dino Raja, Tony Kukoc, Vlade Divac. If those guys could have come to the NBA earlier, I would have liked to have seen the international game be incorporated to the NBA earlier. I think that would have been, really interesting to see how some of those players fared.